Hey guys, and welcome back to another GCSE revision video. Now I've got Mr. Sally's here and we're going to be making not one but two Inspector Calls predictions, because as you know and as you're hopefully well aware by now, when it comes to your Inspector Calls GCSE exams, you always get a choice of two questions. One is always to do with characters and one is to do with themes. So what we've decided is, obviously on First Year Tutors, you're going to be getting a character prediction question for the 2025 exam based on what we think which character is going to be coming up for your exams this year, 2025. But of course, don't forget to head over to Mr. Saleh's channel where we're going to be making theme predictions, okay? So obviously, as I said, remember that you always have a choice of two questions. If you decide you want to only practice and revise for main characters, of course this is going to be super useful for you. But if you lean more towards themes in terms of the flexibility and so on and how to prepare for that, make sure you obviously watch our video and our prediction on what themes to prepare for on Mr. Saleh's channel. So of course, as you can see behind me, we have literally listed out from 2024 all the way to 2017 every single character question that came up in past GCSE exams. What we're going to do is go over them, look for some trends and patterns, and of course I and Mr. Saleh's will be offering our predictions and what we think will be the character Inspector Calls question that will come up in this year's GCSE exam. And by the way guys, don't forget that I'm going to be running a one-off Inspector Calls GCSE masterclass. This is during Easter on the 9th of April. You will see how to apply all the ideas we're going to be going over shortly, as well as how to write a grade 9 model essay in just 1 hour. And you can ask me any questions you have about the upcoming exam, especially if you're feeling stressed out during that lesson. You can sign up for it in the description box below or going to firstratetutors.com. So let's get to it.
All right.
When it comes to the character question, right, let's start off by going over what came up in 2024, right? And this was how Priestley uses the character of Mrs. Burling to explore ideas about social class. How would you approach that type of question, that character question?
So I'm super excited by this question because sometimes AQA turn it into a theme. So when you're writing about social class, it's a theme and it makes it really easy for you to write about Priestley's ideas. So then when we go back to the character, we think, okay, she is constructed. How is she constructed in order to explore this theme? As soon as you start using that sort of language, you're automatically moving towards grade 7. So this is a gift of a question. And obviously Mrs. Burling is the one who has more class prejudices than anyone else. And so it's easy to relate her behaviour and the quotes, her language, to what Priestley is saying about social class. Which is what? Well, the obvious one is that the upper class members of society who are in charge discriminate against those of the working class, represented by Eva. However, we can go deeper here. So Mrs. Burling's social class is in a patriarchal society, and that also makes her discriminate against women, including her own daughter. So I always, if I'm writing about Sheila or Mrs. Burling, I'm always going to include that quote where she says to Sheila, you'll have to get used to it, just as I had, when Sheila is upset that Gerald was away and she suspects he was having an affair. And Mrs. Burling's coded message is, well, of course he was having an affair. That's just what men of our class do. You'll just have to put up with it. And so that links very well to something else that's wrong with the hierarchy in the social class. It also damages the rich.
Okay, and I think Mrs. Burling's character is such an interesting character. I actually always tell my masterclass students, so I had a masterclass specifically on how to answer this question back in October. And I always told my masterclass students that I actually believe that Mrs. Burling's character is an A-level character trapped in a GCSE text.
Nice.
Yes, because I think Mrs. Burling's character, I always tell my students this. If you're unable to go beyond just the surface description of, oh, Mrs. Burling is a hypocrite, she's such a mean character to Daisy Renton, oh, poor Daisy, she's so mean. If you keep your analysis and your description stuck at that level, you have missed 90% of the meaning, the ideas behind Mrs. Burling's character. Mrs. Burling, number one, when it comes to the idea of social class, she sees everything very tribalistically. I always tell my students, when you write, and if you decide to climb that mountain, Mrs. Burling's character, I actually always advise my students, don't write the Mrs. Burling question, because a lot of students, this just goes over their heads because you're studying it as a GCSE text, but she's actually an A-level character. However, if you decide to climb that mountain, remember that to talk about how Mrs. Burling sees everything in terms of class. She sees everything in terms of tribes. She sees us versus them, but also remember that she's so loyal to her class and she's so prejudiced based on class that she's actually more loyal to her class than her gender. Therefore, of course, this question is an interesting question. If you're able to talk about those points, it's very easy to start getting 7s, 8s and 9s in any question that you do in Mrs. Burling's character. The challenge and the trick with writing about Mrs. Burling's character is not getting stuck at more basic analysis. Oh, she's a bad person, blah, blah, blah. You can get away with that with someone like Mr. Burling, Sheila. They just lend themselves a bit more easily. But Mrs. Burling's character is honestly an A-level character trapped in a GCSE text.
Nice.
Right, so for the 2023 question, this question was interesting and we're kind of debating whether this is actually technically a theme question or character question, but it's actually both, right? And we're going to be obviously talking about it also in Mr. Sally's channel when we go over themes. Now, this question is asked students in 2023 how Priestley presents the different ways that older and younger characters respond to the inspector. And of course, the inspector is mentioned as a character. Now, on from the character perspective, this question obviously is interesting when you're thinking about the inspector, but you're almost seeing the inspector as the umbrella from whom you then talk about how he affects the different older and younger characters, right? In this question, by the way, you want to allocate how one paragraph on how the inspector affects the younger generation, so Sheila, Eric, versus separate paragraphs on how the older characters, Mr. and Mrs. Burling, respond to the inspector. Of course, you can also talk about how Gerald, even if he's part of the younger generation, actually still holds onto older generation ideals, that stubbornness and that refusal to change. For this question, how can students approach this?
So this question lends itself to the most valuable part of any text, and especially this one, which is the ending. So at the end of this play, you can see exactly how they've all been affected. And you can get a lot of depth here. So I would start with the inspector's final words, his warnings, and then we'd look at what happens. So the premise of the play is if all the characters learn the inspector's lesson, then society will be changed for the better. But the second phone call, which then says there's another inspector coming, suggests that they haven't learned the lessons. And so they're going to be inspected again. Now we think at the end of the play, Eric and Sheila have learnt the lessons. They say they've learnt the lesson, but the ending makes us question. And Sheila makes us question it because Gerald offers her the ring, and instead of saying, no way, she says, no, not yet, it's too soon, I must think. And so Priestley is planting the idea that though she has learnt the lesson, because it's a patriarchal society, she hasn't got any better choices than Gerald. In fact, when you look at Eric and think how he behaves, if Eric is typical of the upper class man, well, Gerald's wonderful compared to that. And then similarly, Eric, he's learnt the lesson, but he's completely drunk. Like, what will he be like tomorrow, metaphorically speaking? And so I get to the ending and I can discuss whether the younger generation have actually truly learned that lesson, or in Sheila's case, she's learnt it, but she's powerless to do anything with it.
Okay. And now the 2022 question, which by the way will be the question that I'm going to be going over and writing model answers for both questions that came up in the upcoming Easter GCSE masterclass, by the way, because we've already had 2 previous masterclasses looking at model answers of the 2024 and the 2023 back in October and February half term. For this year, students were asked how Eric is presented as a character who learns important lessons about society. What do you think about the Eric questions?
So, well, this again is a godsend, so it carries on from what I've just said. So you can question what lesson he actually does learn. So there's some brilliant quotes with him that I love, which show that he's only pretending to have learnt the lesson. So, for example, when he confesses what he's done to Eva, He says, I was in that state where a chap easily turns nasty. And this is like evasive language. He calls himself a chap, like I'm just a normal bloke. I was in that state, not this is what I did. And he's saying, well, anyone in that state would easily turn nasty. It's a way of deflecting the blame. And I read his character as deflecting his own responsibility all the time. He says to his mother, you killed her. He doesn't take any account of why she chose that option. Well, obviously it's her relationship with him, isn't it? It's his baby. And look what happens. So I think you can easily approach Eric from two different perspectives. And as soon as you do that, you're in top grades.
Yeah, and what's really interesting and tying into approaching Eric's character from two different perspectives is I would actually offer a very different alternative way to interpret how Eric is portrayed as a character who learns important lessons about society. Because I would say the other way you can interpret him is actually he's one of the characters that arguably changes the most. He says, for example, I didn't even remember that was the hellish thing. One way to interpret that is when he's talking about his assault of Daisy Renton. We can already see that he is starting to feel remorse, starting to feel penitent about it. Even at the end when he says, you lot may be letting yourselves out nicely, but I can't. This demonstrates that he has really changed as a character from the secretive, half shy, half assertive character that we'd first met, who was quite secretive at the beginning of the play, right? So I would argue an alternative way to answer this that can still get you 7s, 8s and 9s is actually making the case that he does arguably experience one of the most dramatic changes as a character once he realizes the role he played in Daisy's death. And once he shows this sense of remorse and this sense of penitence, he even actually starts distancing himself from his parents, right? And so that could be an alternative way to see him.
Yes, and that's the more traditional way to see him as well. But I'm proud to say I've got the feminist perspective.
Yes. And so what came up for the 2021 question?
Is that me? No,
Yes.
it's you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that's me.
That's
so
you.
in terms of the 2021 question, this question for the character was to do with Gerald Croft. And Gerald Croft, in this case, students were asked to talk about how Gerald is used to explore ideas about responsibility. Gerald Croft's character is, I would say, the hardest character to write about is Mrs. Burling, but then that's followed by Gerald Croft, right? So Mrs. Burling, I always tell my students, if you see a question on her, unless you know exactly how to answer that question, and of course, that's why I went over the grade 9 model answer, showing them how to write about it. Gerald is the other character who it's very easy to slip into, oh, he's a really posh guy who has this mistress or this side woman, and then he has this affair and then leaves her, right? But actually, again, with Gerald Croft's character, people, a lot of students tend to miss out on the slightly more complex nuances behind him, right? Whilst on the one hand, he seems very respectable, he's actually very two-faced and duplicitous, right? This is shown by the fact that firstly, he actually just completely disappears and ghosts Sheila, right? And he's very slippery in his excuses and responses. And once she really tries to pin him down, he then distracts her with her ring, right? But also when you think about even just his relationship with Daisy, we can see that he's a man that really enjoys the power that he has over other women. We can also see the irony in some of the language that he uses, especially when you talk to the inspector. He says, we're respectable citizens and not criminals. We can actually argue that Gerald is portrayed as someone who definitely rejects taking any social responsibility, but also he actually sees himself as super respectable, even if what he did arguably was criminal in terms of how he treated Daisy Renton, and even to an extent how he abused Sheila, who, whilst we know that the most obvious victim in this play is Eva and Daisy, actually Sheila is a victim and she's victimized by Gerald, right? He takes part in he's the one that actually damages two women, right? Daisy as well as Sheila, right? As opposed to Eric, who only affects that one woman. So Gerald Croft's character is interesting but also complex. And again, lots of students get stuck in, oh, Gerald had this affair, he disappeared, blah, 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 blah. And they only talk about the very surface level of Gerald Croft's character, meaning that they get just trapped in grade 4 or grade 3, right? So Gerald, just like Mrs. Burling, is one of those characters who, if you know how to answer you can do extremely well, right? Because not very many students will be able to write a great essay on him. But if you're not able to grasp those ideas and explain them and expand on them, and this is why obviously I would like to suggest joining in my GCSE Inspector Paul's Easter Masterclass, where you can see, and that's why I always write grade 9 model answers, to show students this is how you develop an essay, this is how you talk about those nuances, right? But if you're not able to do that, avoid the Gerald question.
I love that analysis of Gerald, and I agree with it 100% as well. The really fascinating structural thing about Gerald is he is the only character that Priestley removes from the inspector's lesson. So when the inspector has his last words, Gerald's not there. Why not? He has engineered an escape. He says, I'm much more upset than I appear to be, which is a complete clue that he's just pretending to be upset. He actually goes out because he's suspicious of the inspector, and he goes out to try and find that the inspector's a hoax. He's completely devoted to finding a way to get rid of any of the guilt, any of the social guilt, and he doesn't learn anything about responsibility, he avoids it. And so, like you, I see him as ultimately duplicitous.
Yes. And so what came up for the 2020 question?
So here we got Mr. Burling as a man who cares only for himself and his family. So obviously you can go on about capitalism to your heart's content there, and how he is portrayed, even ridiculed by Priestley when he says, you know, we don't want war, the Titanic's unsinkable, all these ways that he's discredited at the beginning through humour. But the quote about the family is fascinating, because he says a man has to look after himself and his family, and then there's a dash, and the doorbell rings announcing the inspector. So he's cut off in what he's saying about only looking after himself and his family, and that summons the inspector like a supernatural presence, those words. And so the inspector, you can interpret this, the inspector arrives to totally discredit this view. And once you start talking about Burling's relationship with the inspector and the structure of the play, you're automatically top grades, especially when you link it to Priestley's purpose, which is to discredit the capitalist upper class and to promote social responsibility.
Okay, and so for the 2019 question, it was a really nice question to do with Sheila. More specifically, how Sheila is presented as a character who learns important lessons about herself and society. I believe when it comes to a Sheila question, always argues that she experiences the most dramatic change. She experiences the inspector as somebody that teaches her very valuable lessons about herself and society. We can see that Sheila, and especially if you write anything about Sheila or any question that comes up about Sheila, you want to contrast how at the beginning she is portrayed as very naive, very sheltered, and also she deliberately deceives herself about Gerald. Once he presents her with a ring, she seems on track to literally replicate exactly her mum's life, right? However, in contrast, even as the play progresses, right, once Gerald steps in and, you know, the questions are turned against him, we can already see that Sheila did know that he was doing something against her. She's far more intelligent than what she let on, but also her immediate sense of remorse demonstrates once she's told, you were responsible for what happened to her, getting her fired at Millwards, this is why she ended up being a prostitute. Actually, when she then admits, I started it, and even at the end when she's really critical of the parents, right, nothing to change. Actually, you can see that in terms of a character who learns important lessons about herself and society, you could argue that Sheila actually really arguably experiences the most dramatic change and shows that she's learnt the role that she's played and the power that she has to help those who are part of the working classes.
Yeah, definitely. She's definitely the character who 100% learns the lesson. And I'd always go to the ending that I've discussed already to show that even learning that might not be enough in the patriarchal society of 1912. But what we haven't touched on, of course, is the play is being performed and written in 1945. And Priestley is saying, look, all you women in the audience, you've now got the vote. You don't have to settle as Sheila looks like she's had to settle. You can now take control of your lives in a way that she couldn't. Become socially responsible, vote for a socialist government. And so I would link Sheila to that message.
Okay, and then for the 2018 question, we had yet another Eric question, right? Eric as a character who changes his attitude towards himself and others. Would there be any difference in how to approach either of these questions?
So No, I think it's actually the same question,
Exactly
isn't
the
it,
same.
really?
Yeah.
With different words. So we'll go to 2017.
Okay, so obviously the 2018 would literally be exactly the same points
Yeah,
for Eric.
totally the same.
And the 2017 once more is another Mr. Berling character, but instead of how he cares only for himself and his family, it is how Creasy presents Mr. Berling as an unlikable character. Would that be very different to the family point and how he cares for himself and his family? Or would it still be the same idea of capitalism versus socialism and so on?
I think it's the same, don't
Yeah,
you?
I would say so. I would say so.
So I'm getting worried now because the prediction that I made, I'm changing my mind having gone through this.
Okay, so this is predictions time now.
Damn.
And actually, you were speaking of predictions. So I suppose, what was your initial idea in terms of predictions and how has that transformed? And by the way, guys, we've actually color-coded, you know, in blue, we've put the names of the characters that these questions are attached to. But also, as you can see here in red, what we've highlighted is all of the character questions actually have a thematic aspect that still gives you the opportunity to talk about themes and contrast them with how these characters are presented, right? So what were your initial predictions versus now how that's changed?
I've actually filmed a video on this that I haven't released yet, and my prediction is Gerald.
Okay.
And now I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, well, they've had Berlin twice. Are they likely to have? They've had Eric twice. Are they likely to have Gerald twice or Sheila twice?
Okay.
That's a tough call. So I might have to make another video in case it's Sheila.
Okay. I was going to suggest actually, so that's part of my predictions.
Yeah.
I think either Sheila will come up or we're going to get a third Mr. Berling question. Because Zachary sometimes has this habit of just kind of throwing like a really nice and simple and straightforward one, especially because last year was Mrs. Berling, who's actually quite a challenging character. So my prediction is either Sheila coming up as a character who changes. Remember that any kind of Sheila question will be to do with change, and or a Mr. Berling question. Okay, so and of course, if you get either of them, it's such an easy gift to then expand on. Okay, you can kind of be you can discuss all the points that we've talked about in terms of Sheila changing arguably the most, Mr. Berling really being the complete opposite, right? The antithesis of Sheila's character, really sticking rigidly to his old world ideas, old world beliefs, trying to keep society exactly the same so that he can continue to benefit.
So where are you going to catch my video about themes?
Yes, so guys, make sure you head over now to Mr. Salis' channel where we're going to be going over predictions for the theme questions. Thanks so much, guys, for listening.